All right. So today we're going to do a deep dive into something pretty interesting, I think. It's JD Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference.
Yeah.
And what I find interesting about this, and maybe you can expand on it a little bit, is that he chose to use this platform to actually critique Europe.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because, you go to the Munich Security Conference and you kind of expect to hear about, the threats from Russia, from China, things like that. But Vance really uses this as an opportunity to talk about what he sees as this kind of internal threat to, Europe and the West more broadly.
And he kind of frames this as a retreat from values that he believes underpin a strong and free society.
Yeah, and I think, what's also interesting is he doesn't shy away from the fact that the U.S. has struggled with some of these same issues,
right.
Especially around censorship. And he even brings up, the previous administration's pressure on social media companies to censor information about COVID-19, for example.
Yeah, he actually mentions that.
Yeah.
But then he kind of turns his focus to Europe.
Yeah.
And he goes into some pretty specific examples of where he sees free speech being stifled.
Yeah.
One of them that he talks about is the potential for social media shutdowns during unrest in the EU.
Yeah.
Which, some people might look at and say, well, that's just to control, hateful content or whatever. But other people look at it as a way to, limit dissenting voices.
Right. Right. And I think that's the key question here is where do you draw the line? Right.
Yeah.
And he gives, I think a number of examples that really make you think about, where that line is, where it should be drawn, and whether or not, Europe is moving in the right direction.
Yeah. So one of the ones he mentions, he talks about police raids in Germany.
Yeah. Targeting
people who are posting anti-feminist comments online.
Right.
I mean, so think about that for a minute.
Yeah.
Is that a legitimate response to online speech, even if it's offensive? I mean, where do we draw the line there?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, that's a really tough question, right? Because on the one hand, we want to protect people from harassment and really vile speech. But on the other hand, you don't want to create a situation where, people are afraid to express their opinions, even if those opinions are unpopular or offensive to some.
Yeah. And he goes on and he mentions the case of a Christian activist in Sweden who was actually convicted for participating in Quran burnings.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, burning religious texts is incredibly inflammatory.
Absolutely.
But should it be a criminal offense?
Right. And I think this raises, a broader question about whether or not Europe is moving away from this kind of robust protection of free speech that we've come to expect from, liberal democracies.
Right.
And he gives another example from the UK, which I think is particularly striking. There's a man named Adam Smith Connor who was found guilty of silently praying near an abortion clinic.
Wait, silently praying?
Yeah.
How is that even a crime?
Well, so Vance explains that this was tied to the UK's new buffer zone law, which essentially criminalizes any actions, even silent prayer, within a certain distance of an abortion clinic.
Wow.
And the intention may be to protect patients.
Sure.
But Vance argues that this law could have these really chilling implications for freedom of thought and religion.
Oh, wow.
He even points out that similar safe access zones in Scotland could actually potentially criminalize praying inside your own home.
Wow, that's really alarming.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes you wonder if these laws are truly about protecting access to health care.
Right.
Or they're really about, silencing viewpoints that those in power find uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and it gets to this broader trend that Vance is talking about, which is this idea that some of the winners, so to speak, of the Cold War, the champions of liberal democracy, are now exhibiting behaviors that were once associated with, the communist bloc, right?
Right.
Which is, suppressing dissent and controlling information and things like that. And it's a provocative comparison, but it's one that, I think we need to grapple with.
So then he shifts gears a little bit and he starts criticizing the Munich Security Conference itself for banning populist lawmakers.
Right.
And you might agree or disagree with populist ideologies, but shouldn't they have a voice at a conference that's supposedly about, global dialogue?
Right. I mean, Vance's argument is that if you're going to have a real dialogue, you have to be willing to engage with people that you disagree with.
Yeah.
Right. Even people that you might find, distasteful or or even dangerous, because otherwise you're just talking to yourself, right?
Right.
And you're not really strengthening democracy. You're not really, engaging in the kind of robust debate that is necessary for a healthy democracy.
Right. And he ties this into his broader argument about the need for strong democratic mandates, which he says can only be achieved by genuinely listening to citizens, not silencing them.
Right. And he uses this example of a Romanian election that, he claims was swayed by foreign interference,
right,
to suggest that democracies that are easily swayed by these kinds of external forces are not as strong as they appear.
Yeah, sure.
And that maybe there's something deeper going on there in terms of the lack of trust between citizens and their leaders and so on.
Yeah, and then he tackles a topic that is incredibly relevant on both sides of the Atlantic, which is mass migration. And he directly links this to a recent attack in Munich, highlighting the rising immigration numbers, both in Europe and the U.S.
Yeah, he doesn't shy away from this issue at all, and he makes this, I think, very bold statement that no electorate voted for open borders, right? And that ignoring these concerns is actually undermining democratic processes.
Yeah, he's basically saying that citizens are expressing legitimate concerns about their homes, their dreams, their safety, and these concerns shouldn't be dismissed or ignored by political leaders.
Exactly. He's saying that people have a right to be worried about these things, and that their concerns need to be taken seriously.
And so he kind of wraps up his speech with a really powerful call to action, urging European leaders to listen to their people, even when they express dissenting views. And he even quotes Pope John Paul II saying, "Do not be afraid."
Yeah, it's a really powerful ending to the speech, and it really reinforces this central message that democracy thrives on the voices of its citizens,
right?
And that suppressing those voices, no matter how uncomfortable or challenging they may be, ultimately weakens the very foundations of a free society.
So essentially what we're getting from Vance here is a pretty bold critique of what he sees as a worrying trend in Europe.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
And he's challenging, European leaders to re-examine their approach to free speech, to democratic values, and to the concerns of their own citizens.
Absolutely. And I think it raises some really important questions for all of us to consider, right? Like, what is the balance between protecting free speech and preventing harm? How do we ensure that, democratic processes are truly representative of the people that they serve? And how do we navigate the complexities of mass migration in a way that respects both humanitarian concerns and the voices of citizens?
Yeah, I mean, those are tough questions, but ones that, we need to be grappling with.
Absolutely.
And so I think what's really interesting about Vance's speech is it's not just, laying out a bunch of problems. He's actually offering, some solutions, or at least some paths forward.
Right.
And so I'd be curious to hear, from you, what stood out to you from his speech, what resonated the most strongly.
I think for me, what really stands out is this emphasis on the power of citizen voices, right? I mean, we live in a world where, information is constantly being filtered and controlled.
Right.
It's more important than ever to ensure that those voices are heard, even when they, challenge the status quo.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think Vance's speech is a really important reminder that democracy requires constant vigilance and a willingness to engage with different perspectives, even those we might disagree with.
And I think it's a call to remember that the foundation of a free society, it doesn't lie in silencing dissent. It actually lies in embracing, the messy, the sometimes chaotic, but ultimately vital process of open dialogue and debate.
It's a lot to think about.
Yeah.
But before we get too deep into our own analysis, let's actually hear from the man himself.
Yeah, let's hear what Vance has to say. Let's listen to that full speech now by U.S. Vice President JD Vance. Audio of full speech plays.
Yeah, hearing him lay it all out like that, I think, really brings home that sense of urgency he's trying to convey.
Yeah, and it's interesting how he weaves in those personal anecdotes, the historical references, current events, to kind of build his case. Right. He's not just appealing to logic, but he's really trying to connect with the audience on an emotional level.
Yeah. And, his humor which I don't know you wouldn't necessarily expect in that kind of a setting, adds a human touch.
Yeah.
I think, it's disarming, especially when he throws in that comparison between Greta Thunberg and Elon Musk.
Right.
It's like he's saying, look, we can handle robust debate. European democracies shouldn't be afraid of it.
Exactly. And it's a clever way to kind of make his point right, because by using humor, it makes it more accessible, but it also kind of underscores his central argument, which is that democracies shouldn't be afraid of dissenting voices, even those that are seen as provocative or controversial.
What really stood out to me, too, is how directly he addresses the audience, like particularly the European leaders who were there, right? He's not just offering observations. He's issuing a challenge like, hey, you need to reconsider your priorities and really listen to the concerns of your citizens.
And he does that really effectively by appealing to those shared values, right? He emphasizes the historical ties between the U.S. and Europe, especially, during the Cold War. And he's highlighting the importance of defending those democratic principles. It's like he's saying, hey, remember those values that we fought for? Well, the fight to protect them is still going on today.
But he's not just stuck in the past either. Right? He also looks ahead and he urges those leaders to think about what kind of future they're building. And he argues that without a clear vision, a strong sense of shared purpose, it's going to be really tough to rally citizens and address the complex challenges that Europe's facing.
Right. And this is where he makes a pretty bold claim. He says focusing on external threats just isn't enough. He really believes that Europe's greatest threat comes from within, from this erosion of those democratic values and the suppression of dissenting voices. It's pretty provocative, and I'm sure it'll generate a lot of debate.
And he doesn't shy away from controversial topics like we were saying before, things like mass migration.
Sure.
He connects it directly to that recent attack in Munich, and he argues that if we ignore the concerns that citizens have on these issues, we're actually undermining democratic processes.
And that's a big part of what he's saying, right? He's saying that citizens have a right to voice their concerns about issues that are impacting their lives directly, and that silencing those concerns isn't just undemocratic, it's actually dangerous. It can lead to resentment, alienation, and ultimately instability.
Yeah, and he makes a good point, I think, when he says that no electorate voted for open borders. Right? He's highlighting the fact that there's a disconnect between the policies of a lot of European leaders and what the people they represent actually want. He's reminding us that democracy means that you have to be constantly engaged and willing to listen to everyone, not just the people who already agree with you.
And he ties that directly to the whole issue of security, right? He says that a society that's afraid of its own people, that tries to silence different viewpoints, ultimately ends up being a weak society that's vulnerable to threats both inside and out.
So what do you think are the implications of this speech? How is it going to land with these European leaders and the rest of the international community?
I mean, it's definitely going to get some strong reactions. Some people are going to praise him for being so bold, for challenging the way things are and speaking truth to power. But others are going to criticize him. They'll say he's fear-mongering and undermining relationships with our allies.
We should remember, too, that Vance isn't just speaking for himself. He's representing the current U.S. administration. And this speech is part of their broader foreign policy goals, which focus on things like national sovereignty, border security, and a more assertive approach to global affairs.
It's also interesting to consider the setting, right? The Munich Security Conference is this gathering of global elites, and Vance's message about the importance of listening to regular people is going to challenge their worldview.
So how do we make sense of all this? What are the big takeaways from Vance's speech, and what are the questions we should be asking ourselves moving forward?
One of the main takeaways, I think, is that we need open and honest conversations, even on difficult and controversial topics. He's saying that democracies can't survive if they're scared of people disagreeing, and that trying to silence those voices is just going to make things worse and divide people even more.
He's also pushing for a more realistic view of security, one that understands how important it is to listen to what people are worried about and build a sense of shared purpose and identity.
And he reminds us that democracy isn't just something we watch, it's something we participate in. It means being willing to hear other people's opinions and trying to find common ground even when we don't agree on everything.
These are powerful ideas, and they're going to resonate with a lot of people, both in Europe and around the world. His speech is a call to action. It's challenging us to rethink our ideas about democracy, security, and the role that citizens play in shaping the future.
It's interesting how he frames this whole argument.
It's not just about some abstract principles. He actually ties them to what's happening in the world and how it's affecting people,
Yeah.
on both sides of the Atlantic.
Right. He uses specific examples, those real cases like that attack in Munich, the Quran burning in Sweden, and that guy praying near the clinic in the UK, to show that what he's talking about has real consequences. It's not just theory.
And he does it in a way that makes you think, but also makes it easy to understand. He's not talking down to anyone. He's saying, hey, let's have a real conversation about the stuff that's challenging democracies today.
And it's interesting the timing of it all, right? Because there's already all this worry about what's going to happen to democracy in both Europe and the US. We're seeing more and more populism, nationalism, and people are divided. It makes you wonder if our systems can really handle the problems of the 21st century.
Yeah, his speech taps into that feeling of unease, but he doesn't just leave it there. He's saying a way forward is not to shut people up or abandon democratic values, but to actually double down on them.
He's calling for us to trust in people's ability to make good decisions about their own lives and their societies, to really believe in the wisdom of the people.
It's powerful stuff, and I think it'll connect with a lot of people who are feeling let down by how politics is working right now.
Oh, yeah, for sure. But it's also going to push back from people who think the answer is more control, less free speech, more power at the top.
This isn't a debate that's going away.
Yeah.
And Vance's speech has definitely stirred things up.
It's a speech that people need to talk about, argue about, really pick apart. It makes us think about what's important to us, what we believe in, and what kind of world we're trying to build for ourselves and everyone who comes after us.
That's what makes these deep dives so interesting. It's not just about one speech. It's about wrestling with the really big questions that are changing the world right now.
Yeah, it's about understanding that there's not always an easy answer, and that to solve these really complicated problems, we have to think hard, talk openly, and be willing to listen to each other, even when we don't agree.
And at the end of the day, we have to remember that democracy is on us. It's our job to be involved, to speak our minds, and to work together to create a society that's more just and fair and free for everybody.
Let's now listen to the full speech by U.S. Vice President JD Vance.
To all the gathered delegates and luminaries and media professionals, and thanks especially to the hosts of the Munich Security Conference for being able to put on such an incredible event. We're, of course, thrilled to be here. We're happy to be here. And, one of the things that I wanted to talk about today is, of course, our shared values. And, it's great to be back in Germany. As you heard earlier, I was here last year as United States Senator. I saw Foreign Secretary David Lammy, and joked that both of us last year had different jobs than we have now. But now it's time for all of our countries, for all of us who have been fortunate enough to be given political power by our respective peoples, to use it wisely to improve their lives. And I want to say that, I was fortunate in my time here to spend some time outside the walls of this conference over the last 24 hours. And I've been so impressed by the hospitality of the people, even as, of course, as they're reeling from yesterday's horrendous attack. And the first time I was ever in Munich was with my wife, actually, who's here with me today, on a personal trip. And I've always loved the city of Munich, and I've always loved its people. And I just want to say that we're very moved, and our thoughts and prayers are with Munich and everybody affected by the evil and inflicted on this beautiful community. We're thinking about you, we're praying for you, and we will certainly be rooting for you in the days and weeks to come. Now, I hope that's not the last bit of applause that I get, but we gather at this conference, of course, to discuss security, and normally we mean threats to our external security. I see many great military leaders gathered here today. But while the Trump administration is very concerned with European security and believes that we can come to a reasonable settlement between Russia and Ukraine, and we also believe that it's important in the coming years for Europe to step up in a big way to provide for its own defense, the threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. And what I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values shared with the United States of America. Now, I was struck that a former European commissioner went on television recently and sounded delighted that the Romanian government had just annulled an entire election. he warned that if things don't go to plan, the very same thing could happen in Germany too. Now, these cavalier statements are shocking to American ears. For years, we've been told that everything we fund and support is in the name of our shared democratic values. Everything from our Ukraine policy to digital censorship is billed as a defense of democracy. But when we see European courts canceling elections and senior officials threatening to cancel others, we ought to ask whether we're holding ourselves to an appropriately high standard. And I say ourselves because I fundamentally believe that we are on the same team. We must do more than talk about democratic values, we must live them. Now, within living memory of many of you in this room, the Cold War positioned defenders of democracy against much more tyrannical forces on this continent. And consider the side in that fight that censored dissidents, that closed churches, that canceled elections. Were they the good guys? Certainly not. And thank God they lost the Cold War. They lost because they neither valued nor respected all of the extraordinary blessings of liberty. The freedom to surprise, to make mistakes, invent, to build. As it turns out, you can't mandate innovation or creativity, just as you can't force people what to think, what to feel, or what to believe. And we believe those things are certainly connected. And unfortunately, when I look at Europe today, it's sometimes not so clear what happened to some of the Cold War's winners. I look to Brussels, where EU commissars warn citizens that they intend to shut down social media during times of civil unrest the moment they spot what they've judged to be, quote, hateful content. Or to this very country, where police have carried out raids against citizens suspected of posting anti-feminist comments online as part of, quote, combating misogyny on the internet, a day of action. I look to Sweden, where 2 weeks ago the government convicted a Christian activist for participating in Koran burnings that resulted in his friend's murder. And as the judge in his case chillingly noted, Sweden's laws to supposedly protect free expression do not, in fact, grant, and I'm quoting, a free pass to do or say anything without risking offending the group that holds that belief. And perhaps most concerningly, I look to our very dear friends, the United Kingdom, where the backslide away from conscience rights has placed the basic liberties of religious Britons in particular in the crosshairs. A little over 2 years ago, the British government charged Adam Smith Connor, a 51-year-old physiotherapist and an Army veteran, with the heinous crime of standing 50 meters from an abortion clinic and silently praying for 3 minutes. Not obstructing anyone, not interacting with anyone, just silently praying on his own. And after British law enforcement spotted him and demanded to know what he was praying for, Adam replied simply, it was on behalf of the unborn son he and his former girlfriend had aborted years before. Now, the officers were not moved. Adam was found guilty of breaking the government's new buffer zones law, which criminalizes silent prayer and other actions that could influence a person's decision within 200 meters of an abortion facility. He was sentenced to pay thousands of pounds in legal costs to the prosecution. Now, I wish I could say that this was a fluke, a one-off crazy example of a badly written law being enacted against a single person. But no, this last October, just a few months ago, the Scottish government began distributing letters to citizens whose houses lay within so-called safe access zones, warning them that even private prayer within their own homes may amount to breaking the law. Naturally, the government urged readers to report any fellow citizen suspected guilty of thought crime. In Britain and across Europe, free speech, I fear, is in retreat. And in the interest of comedy, my friends, but also in the interest of truth, I will admit that sometimes the loudest voices for censorship have come not from within Europe, but from within my own country, where the prior administration threatened and bullied social media companies to censor so-called misinformation, Misinformation like, for example, the idea that coronavirus had likely leaked from a laboratory in China. Our own government encouraged private companies to silence people who dared to utter what turned out to be an obvious truth. So I come here today not just with an observation, but with an offer. And just as the Biden administration seemed desperate to silence people for speaking their minds, so the Trump administration will do precisely the opposite, and I hope that we can work together on that. In Washington, there is a new sheriff in town, and under Donald Trump's leadership, we may disagree with your views, but we will fight to defend your right to offer in the public square, agree or disagree. Now, we're at the point, of course, that the situation has gotten so bad that this December, Romania straight up canceled the results of a presidential election based on the flimsy suspicions of an intelligence agency and enormous pressure from its continental neighbors. Now, as I understand it, the argument was that Russian disinformation had infected the Romanian elections. But I'd ask my European friends to have some perspective. You can believe it's wrong for Russia to buy social media advertisements to influence your elections. We certainly do. You can condemn it on the world stage even. But if your democracy can be destroyed with a few $100,000 of digital advertising from a foreign country, then it wasn't very strong to begin with. Now, the good news is that I happen to think your democracies are substantially less brittle than many people apparently fear. And I really do believe that allowing our citizens to speak their mind will make them stronger still. Which, of course, brings us back to Munich, where the organizers of this very conference have banned lawmakers representing populist parties on both the left and the right from participating in these conversations. Now, again, we don't have to agree with everything or anything that people say. But when people represent, when political leaders represent an important constituency, it is incumbent upon us to at least participate in dialogue with them. Now, to many of us on the other side of the Atlantic, it looks more and more like old entrenched interests hiding behind ugly Soviet-era words like misinformation and disinformation, who simply don't like the idea that somebody with an alternative viewpoint might express a different opinion or, God forbid, vote a different way or, even worse, win an election. Now, this is a security conference, and I'm sure you all came here prepared to talk about how exactly you intend to increase defense spending over the next few years in line with some new target. And that's great, because as President Trump has made abundantly clear, he believes that our European friends must play a bigger role in the future of this continent. We don't think, you hear this term, burden sharing, but we think it's an important part of being in a shared alliance together that the Europeans step up while America focuses on areas of the world that are in great danger. But let me also ask you, how will you even begin to think through the kinds of budgeting questions if we don't know what it is that we are defending in the first place? I've heard a lot already in my conversations, and I've had many, many great conversations with many people gathered here in this room. I've heard a lot about what you need to defend yourselves from, and of course that's important. But what has seemed a little bit less clear to me, and certainly I think to many of the citizens of Europe, is what exactly it is that you're defending yourselves for. What is the positive vision that animates this shared security compact that we all believe is so important? And I believe deeply that there is no security if you are afraid of the voices, the opinions, and the conscience that guide your very own people. Europe faces many challenges, but the crisis this continent faces right now, the crisis I believe we all face together, is one of our own making. If you're running in fear of your own voters, there is nothing America can do for you. Nor, for that matter, is there anything that you can do for the American people who elected me and elected President Trump. You need democratic mandates to accomplish anything of value in the coming years. Have we learned nothing that thin, mandates produce unstable results, but there is so much of value that can be accomplished with the kind of democratic mandate that I think will come from being more responsive to the voices of your citizens. If you're going to enjoy competitive economies, if you're going to enjoy affordable energy and secure supply chains, then you need mandates to govern, because you have to make difficult choices to enjoy all of these things. And of course, we know that very well in America. You cannot win a democratic mandate by censoring your opponents or putting them in jail, whether that's the leader of the opposition, a humble Christian praying in her own home, or a journalist trying to report the news. Nor can you win one by disregarding your basic electorate on questions like who gets to be a part of our shared society. And of all the pressing challenges that the nations represented here face, I believe there is nothing more urgent than mass migration. Today, almost 1 in 5 people living in this country moved here from abroad. That is, of course, an all-time high. It's a similar number, by the way, in the United States, also an all-time high. The number of immigrants who entered the EU from non-EU countries doubled between 2021 and 2022 alone, and of course, it's gotten much higher since. And we know this situation, it didn't materialize in a vacuum. It's the result of a series of conscious decisions made by politicians all over the continent and others across the world over the span of a decade. We saw the horrors wrought by these decisions yesterday in this very city. And of course, I can't bring it up again without thinking about the terrible victims who had a beautiful winter day in Munich ruined. Our thoughts and prayers are with them and will remain with them. But why did this happen in the first place? It's a terrible story, but it's one we've heard way too many times in Europe and unfortunately too many times in the United States as well. An asylum seeker, often a young man in his mid-20s, already known to police, rams a car into a crowd and shatters a community. How many times must we suffer these appalling setbacks before we change course and take our shared civilization in a new direction? No voter on this continent went to the ballot box to open the floodgates to millions of unvetted immigrants. But you know what they did vote for? In England, they voted for Brexit, and agree or disagree, they voted for it. And more all over Europe, they're voting for political leaders who promise to put an end to out-of-control migration. Now, I happen to agree with a lot of these concerns, but you don't have to agree with me. I just think that people care about their homes, they care about their dreams, they care about their safety and their capacity to provide for themselves and their children. And they're smart. I think this is one of the most important things I've learned in my brief time in politics. Contrary to what you might hear a couple mountains over in Davos, the citizens of all of our nations don't generally think of themselves as educated animals or as interchangeable cogs of a global economy. And it's hardly surprising that they don't want to be shuffled about or relentlessly ignored by their leaders. And it is the business of democracy to adjudicate these big questions at the ballot box. I believe that dismissing people, dismissing their concerns, or worse yet, shutting down media, shutting down elections, or shutting people out of the political process protects nothing. In fact, it is the most surefire way to destroy democracy. And speaking up and expressing opinions isn't election interference. Even when people express views outside your own country, and even when those people are very influential. And trust me, I say this with all humor, if American democracy can survive 10 years of Greta Thunberg scolding, you guys can survive a few months of Elon Musk. But what no democracy, American, German, or European, will survive is telling millions of voters that their thoughts and concerns, their aspirations, their pleas for relief are invalid or unworthy of even being considered. Democracy rests on the sacred principle that the voice of the people matters. There's no room for firewalls. You either uphold the principle or you don't. Europeans, The people have a voice. European leaders have a choice. And my strong belief is that we do not need to be afraid of the future. Embrace what your people tell you, even when it's surprising, even when you don't agree. And if you do so, you can face the future with certainty and with confidence, knowing that the nation stands behind each of you. And that, to me, is the great magic of democracy. It's not in these stone buildings or beautiful hotels. It's not even in the great institutions that we built together as a shared society. To believe in democracy is to understand that each of our citizens has wisdom and has a voice. And if we refuse to listen to that voice, even our most successful fights will secure very little. As Pope John Paul II, in my view, one of the most extraordinary champions of democracy on this continent or any other, once said, "Do not be afraid." We shouldn't be afraid of our people, even when they express views that disagree with their leadership. Thank you all. Good luck to all of you. God bless you.